When I started in this field, I was befuddled by consciousness, and I remain befuddled by consciousness, right? So the hard problem of consciousness is, how is it possible that transfer of sodium, potassium, and other ions across membranes can lead to the subjective experience of me looking at you? Like, I open my eyes and I'm surrounded by this 3D movie. Where's the movie coming from? It's not playing in my head because nobody's watching anything in my head. All I have are patterns of electricity, and yet I have the subjective experience.
Can you imagine our brains are no longer the smartest thing on the planet, and what will that mean for humanity?
There's ways in which we're already there in terms of the answer to your question. So there are artificial, somewhat neural network-based systems that are now capable of learning through self-play how to find strategies that no human being ever discovered for playing games like chess or Go, and that it's sort of hard to imagine any sort of human being with our biological limitations, which in many ways are very different from the limitations of artificial systems, catching up with those kinds of artificial systems. So I don't think that it's like like a singularity or not. I think it's more like there's many, many ways in which machines are going to have capabilities, and there's many, many ways in which humans have capabilities. I think it's extremely likely that there won't be any particular capabilities that we have that machines can't have.
We conceive of the mind as an emergent phenomenon. Well, what does emergence mean? Emergence means that there are properties that are in the whole system that are not in any of the parts. And somehow these parts are interacting with each other, and they are making the mind, they are making what we perceive, what we pay attention to, what we learn, what we do, and what we think.
All right, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show, as always, brought to you by the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine. Hey, here's a recent issue on artificial intelligence. We're going to be talking about that today. Today's show, you can always go to skeptic.com and order any of the back issues all the way back to 1992. Yeah, we've been doing this for a while. All right, my guests today are Gaurav Suri. He's an associate professor of psychology at San Francisco State University. He's a computational neuroscientist and an experimental psychologist. He's the director of the RAD Lab, R-A-D Lab, RAD Lab, where he studies the mechanisms that shape motivated action and decision-making. He's the co-author of the prize-winning novel A Certain Ambiguity and several dozen influential research papers. He's also co-author on the book with my next guest, Jay McClelland. He's a professor of psychology and computer science and linguistics at Stanford University. He's one of the most influential and well-known cognitive scientists of the past century, founder of the study of artificial neural networks, which we're going to be talking about a lot today. And his publications have been cited by more than 100,000 times. Wow, that's impressive. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. CJ, you'd be knighted by now, but you're American. That's too bad. All those British guys like you, they're like Lord and Sir and all this stuff. Our founding fathers didn't want any of that for our people. That's too bad. Anyway, the two authors met in 2014, and they co-authored this book just out this week when we release this. The Emergent Mind, How Intelligence Arises in People and Machines. There it is. Check it out. Gentlemen, nice to see you. Thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for writing this super interesting book.
Thanks for having
me. To be here, Michael.
Yeah, let's start. I always like to get a little personal background on my guests. Why don't we start with you, Gaurav? How did you get into study? You have an interesting background. You mentioned at the beginning of your book about how you got into all this stuff. Give us your journey.
Right. My journey is that I came to academics in midlife. Before that, I was a management consultant. I was a partner at Deloitte Consulting. And I was really intrigued by how people make decisions. And this idea that, we've got some people in the room, we've got some data, so let's make a decision about how printers should be priced in Korea or something. And people had a lot of certainty about these decisions, but I was constantly perhaps sharing this with you, Michael, skeptical about, wait, if this person wasn't in the room, would we have arrived at a different decision? How did we really come to these decisions? Is this person saying this because they got up late? Is this person saying this for some other reason? So I was really impressed by the various things that go into decision making, some of them in conscious awareness, some of them not. And it was these kinds of questions that got me, after a career in industry, back to academics to Stanford, where I met Jay and embarked on this journey, which eventually led to this book.
Nice. Jay, you're one of the legends. I'm honored to have you on the show, and I've seen your name on an awful lot of publications. What's your journey?
So I got interested in the mind at a very early age. And when I went to college, I found myself gravitating towards fields where I could follow up on that. So I studied actually literature, sociology, and behavior. I majored in psychology, which was the simplest major, the fewest courses required because you could take all these other courses and sort of diversify your background. But I got a lot out of thinking about, what Shakespeare and other authors thought about why people did what they did and how they made me think about that, and what sociologists thought about that, and what psychologists had discovered about all that. And I also learned, and this is sort of beginning to get to the theme of our book, about the neural mechanisms that our brain might be using that underlie these psychological phenomena that we experience and think about as scientists. So when I was leaving my undergraduate background, I was ready to start thinking about, how do we understand how these experiences we have connect with the underlying processes that are taking place within our brains.
Yeah, maybe given your background and the length of time in the field, you could kind of reflect briefly on the transition from behaviorism to cognitive psych to neuroscience to what you're doing now.
In the early part of the 20th century, there was this very, very strong dimension of American psychology that was focused on completely ignoring the brain and just asking what, the laws of behavior might be. And the idea was it was too speculative to make any claims about processes that took place inside the head. It was before it was very easy to record from neurons or study that directly. And so there was this movement within the field to simply write down descriptive laws of behavior. And B.F. Skinner was probably the most strongly associated with that. B.F. Skinner was also extremely strongly associated with the concept that its experience, and in his case, the contingencies of rewards and outcomes that are consequences of behavior that shape the behavior that we have, and that you can understand why people or animals or any other organism does what they do in terms of these very, very general laws of behavior. And around the middle of the 20th century, there was a big pushback on that from many different directions. People felt like, there's something going on inside my mind when I perceive inputs and give responses between the stimulus and the response. There's something happening there. Let's try to study that, right? And so they developed experiments. This was experimental psychology of the 1950s to show that, there was a very brief period of time after a visual stimulus that was presented to you that you could still read off different parts of it if you were cued to that location, but it faded very quickly. So you couldn't read the whole thing with it before it faded, and there were experiments that supported that, arguing that you had to posit an internal representation in the mind to capture this data. The other dimension of this was the argument that there was very, very strong innate determinants of behavior. That's a completely different thread that kind of came in a criticism of Skinner's approach. Skinner is saying everything is completely domain general, all based on learning. A lot of other people were saying, wait a minute, rats learn these things, pigeons learn those things. It's because they're prepared to learn one thing or another. And then Chomsky comes along and says, yes, and humans are prepared to learn language. There's a special module in your brain for language. And so Chomsky pushed back really strongly on Skinner, saying, no, it's not simple enough to explain it by just these simple contingencies of reinforcement. you need to imagine that there's built-in structure that underlies our ability to process language, and then we can study these representations in our mind, maybe using behavioral experiments. So that was the cognitive revolution of around 1960. And I went to graduate school in 70, so my undergrad education was like lagging a little bit, but I finally got to a place where the cognitive revolution had been taken note of in my graduate career. And I started thinking about those kinds of cognitive issues, but with that background I mentioned of having been exposed to a little bit of neuroscience as an undergrad.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute, when we think about perceptions, we think in terms of neural mechanisms. But when we think about language, we're not allowed to do that, right? We have to think about it abstractly. Let's not, it's the same brain, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Here, I'll show you this. You'll get a kick out of this. This is my master's degree on choice behavior, specifically. I have to read it because I can't remember it. There's the signature page. The title is Choice in Rats as a Function of Reinforcer Intensity and Quality, a thesis presented to the faculty of the California State University, Fullerton. And it said, we were testing the Matching Law, 76.
76.
Oh, no, sorry, 1978. Doug Maverick, Margaret White, Meg White, she was an ethologist, animal behaviorist there, and Michael Scavio, who was an experimental psychologist also.
These revolutions play themselves out slowly, because the world had...
So that was the matching law. Will rats press the bar twice as much on the right bar versus the left bar if you double the reinforcement rate or quality or whatever? We mixed different levels of sugar, then had another one with salt in it. Anyways, and then, then I went off and did something completely different. And when I came back...
Did they press twice as often or no?
No, not quite. It was the formula had to be modified. Yeah. And then, of course, pigeons do something different than rats. And then one of my lab mates used humans. And then by the time I came back to academia, 10 years later, no one was interested in any of this stuff. I went, oh, I missed something big here. Amazing. Okay, so Gaurav, let's come back to you. One of the objections that my thesis advisor, Doug Maverick, had as a behaviorist was the fuzziness of the language, using words like mind or remembered or she figured it out or she realized. We have these kind of, as he described it, we're reifying these things in the brain like they're really there. And maybe they are, but it was the language part. So where are we now with using words like, he remembered or they figured it out or thinking or consciousness?
Yeah. So we have an abiding intuition that our conscious experience, how we see things, how we feel things happening, our attribution of causes. Why did I do this? Why did I take a taco, not a burrito? Why did I take vacation now? Why did I leave academia or come back to academia? That these have very clear, consciously accessible correlates. And many people, including psychologists, sort of have a triumphant cascade of what they think it feels like to what they postulate exists in the brain. So if we often follow goals, boy, by golly, there must be a goal driver in our brain. If we sometimes have habits, there must be a habit driver in our brain. So it's sort of this triumphant cascade, Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, called it, of observing something, assuming that that's the entirety of what's going on, and then postulating that the brain is implementing that as it sees it, as we perceive it in our conscious field. Like everything's available to us. We're walking around right now. I'm seeing the two of you on my screen, and I'm saying this, and the idea is that this is it. Everything we do is shaped by what we have access to. Well, beginning in the 70s, there was really beautiful data that we do things that we don't have conscious reasons for. And oftentimes the conscious reasons that we provide have nothing to do with what's going on. And I had, like many, many others, been struck by this because I changed my mind, even though no objective facts had changed. There were so many things that made me think, this idea that I'm a logical engine and I'm deciding things can't be right. And Michael, you asked, where are we? And where we are right now, at least where our book is, where Jay and my book is that we conceive of the mind as an emergent phenomena. What does emergence mean? Emergence means that there are properties that are in the whole system that are not in any of the parts. And somehow these parts are interacting with each other, and they are making the mind, they are making what we perceive, what we pay attention to, what we learn, what we do, and what we think. And it's this idea of emergence that is the same conscious thoughts do arise. Of course they arise, but they are a consequence of these underlying interactions. They're not so much the cause of all of these things that we do in this life. There are activations among simple processing units, neurons, and these activations lead to our actions. They also lead to our conscious thoughts. And sometimes these conscious thoughts are very good models of what we do, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes the real causes are hidden from us.
Yeah. So you make the analogy between like individual ants in an ant colony, like here, moving around an obstacle in their pathway. And the point of this is that no one ant knows exactly what it's doing, but all of them together are operating in a way that no one of them would by themselves. And that's what you mean by emergent property. And so here's the problem. How do we get past this idea that, using the word emergence, we don't want it to be like, and then a miracle happens and mind poofs is there. There's mind. 'Cause sometimes you'll hear people say that, and then mind emerges from brain. Yeah, but how?
Yeah.
And I guess that's the point of the
question that we are trying to answer.
Yes.
By building neural network models to capture these emergent phenomena. Okay, so you put your finger exactly on the essence of what the group of us were trying to do at UCSD in the late 70s and early 80s when we began to think about this. I think there are many other people who were also thinking about that, well before us and continue to do so afterwards. But that was the question. I think that's in some sense the question that Hopfield was trying to answer when he built his little artificial neural network that led him to be a recipient of the Nobel Prize with Jeff Hinson last year as well, and that led Jeff Hinson to sort of start trying to build artificial neural network models that would, carry out computations that we attribute to people and we would love to understand more deeply. So the essence of the approach, underlying the emergent mind, is to postulate a simpler system than the entire brain, which nevertheless has this characteristic of having these tiny little components, each of which is very simple, that are connected to each other in certain ways, so that collectively they give rise to an emergent phenomenon that could be something that would have been published in a paper by a psychologist who was studying perception. So, for example, a person sees a letter more clearly when it's embedded in a word than when it occurs by itself. And that was a very confusing finding to a lot of people because they sort of thought, well, gee, in order to recognize a word, you'd have to first recognize the letters. So if you'd already recognized the letters, why does it help you when it happens to be in a word to see what that letter is? And in fact, people thought it was logically incoherent that you could somehow, the word could help you see the letter better. And what we set out to do was to build a little neural network model in which we have units like neurons. They're not exactly like neurons, but each of them is a simple unit that collects inputs from other units. And if on balance, the input is excitatory, it makes the unit more active. If it's on balance inhibitory, it makes it less active. So the signals could be positive or negative. And then we wired it up so that there were units for features, for letters, and for words. And the units for the words were just bidirectionally connected to the letters. Okay. The other assumption we made is that processing is a continuous updating of these graded activations of these units, so that when the input comes in, it starts to activate units, but then they start to activate other units, and these activation processes are overlapping. So as the letters become active, they activate the words. As the words become active, by the return connections, they reinforce the activation of the letter units. And lo and behold, the pattern of activation produced by the stimulus persists and is sustained by virtue of this bidirectional interactive activation between these simple processing units. So this was the paper that Rumelhart and I wrote. It was published in the Psychological Review in 1981 that got a lot of people interested in, maybe we should think not in terms of discrete steps of computation like a simple computer program, but continuous bidirectional and interactive processes mutually influencing each other in ways that could be captured in a neural network. And the brain consists of neurons, units that are like this. They receive excitatory and inhibitory signals from others. Their activations go up or down depending on the balance of those inputs. So it both connected psychological theory to the brain and also provided an alternative way of thinking about the psychology itself, that it's based on graded and interactive processes that could be implemented in a neural circuit.
Yeah, nice.
So
Gaurav?
there's a general point here. I don't want to lose your question. And your question is, wait, it's not enough to claim emergence, right? It's like you can't say, oh, this is emergent thing, there's some simple properties, and then emergence happens. The ant example that you talk about is an example. It's a tiny example of how you can trace simple properties leading to complex behavior. This is the central point. And this is not just in ants or brains or psychological phenomena. This is a law, I think, of the universe, that the repeated application of simple rules again and again and again can lead to great complexity. And the instantiation of this general phenomena in human and animal behavior is well captured in the neural network. So the reason that ants go around the short end of the obstacle and not the long end is not because they understand this is short and that's long. It's because the pheromone trail on the short end gets concentrated, and you can trace what ants are doing to really understand how that emergent behavior is arising. Now, sometimes we can apply simple properties and understand the emergence. And other times we have to acknowledge that, we don't exactly know how this emergent property is arising, but it is arising. And that's just because in that particular context, the dynamics are so complicated that one can't trace, without actually going through the complete computation, what's leading to this emergent behavior. What neural networks do an extraordinarily effective job of is allow one to test the consequences of these simple things that neuron-like things are doing and seeing, hey, can we understand this emergence? Right? That's the point of a neural network. And emergence is everywhere in the universe. I mean, lots of physicists who study the universe are studying with emergence. Sometimes we can connect simple properties to those phenomena. Sometimes we can't. Neural networks are tools to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, since you mentioned Dan Dennett, I liked his book From Bacteria to Brains on the termite mound example he used. These massive structures in Australia that these termites build, but no one termite has any idea it's building a skyscraper, right? So it's something like that. So here's your unit. You have a nice illustration there of a single neuron with its dendritic connections that lead to other neurons that connect them with a synaptic gap there. Across the gap goes these little neurochemical transmitter substances that cause the other neuron to fire.
I'm pleased that you're showing the readers the visuals in our book, because they do play an important role in communicating.
Yes, absolutely. So here's the hard problem of consciousness, right? That's you're tackling indirectly. how do you get this mechanical system of just chemicals swapping across gaps that are, I guess also electrical since they're ions and charged into something like what we're doing now, or memory, or just, pick any topic you want using your neural network models. And also, are you saying, so you have these computer models modeling what's going in the brain, but there really are neural networks in the brain. They really are there. You could map them, scan them, see them, or further. Yeah.
So my answer to this question is that I don't personally seek to understand the conscious experience itself, because I think that's very tricky to study. So what I do in my research, and it was exemplified in those studies on perception of letters and words, there's an actual experimental finding that we're trying to capture with our simulation. And if a body of research has been done on this finding over a period of 6 or 8 years, as it had been when Romelhard and I started collaborating, a fair amount was known about it. And it wasn't possible to sort of just wave your hands and say, well, this idea would account for all of that. What you had to do was to construct a model that would simultaneously address all the findings that, had been introduced in the literature so far. And then another thing that the field requires of us as scientists is that we make new predictions that our model predicts and other models wouldn't have predicted. And then we test them and see that there's a grain of, that prediction held up. It doesn't mean that your model is correct, but it means that you have a potential synthetic understanding of this phenomenon that, and then you can think to yourself well, how do I relate what goes on in my model to these things that I find harder to pin down, this conscious experience? So I was a subject in experiments on perception of letters and words myself. I ran them, that's what I did in graduate school. And my co-author and I would be subjects in each other's experiments. And we would have these experiential phenomena of feeling okay, when the stimulus is a word, I see it better. It's more clear in my experience, right? I experience it as a sharper and clearer visual input. And yet I know that the duration of the presentation wasn't longer, So how can that be? My model explains that, right? By saying that the interactions between the units in the neuron cause the units that are the neurons that are participating in this representation to be activated more strongly and to persist in their activation for longer because of their reciprocal mutual excitation. And this then provides something I can say, okay, that dwell time, that persistence of that state in my in my model might correspond. It's just a hypothesis, but it might correspond to my perceptual experience when I'm feeling that I see the stimulus when it's a word, and there was just a smudge there when it wasn't a word. So the connection to consciousness is more speculative for me, but the connection to modeling the phenomena that we observe is a real constraint on our efforts that leads the reviewers at the psychological review to, express skepticism when there are phenomena that they know about that we're not accounting for, and so on. I'd like to connect it to the brain, though, a little bit, because today the technologies are getting more and more powerful from recording in detail from large populations of neurons simultaneously in the brains, especially of behaving animals like rodents and monkeys to some extent, but occasionally under conditions where there has to be a surgical intervention in the brain anyway, we can get detailed recordings for populations of human brains. And so we can connect the models that we have that we were building in the late 70s and early 80s before a lot of those technologies were as available as they are today to these recordings. And our theories are now responsive not only to can we account for the overt behavior, but can we account for what we see in the neural activity as well?
Nice.
So I want to make a point that I want to make sure isn't lost here. When I started in this field, I was befuddled by consciousness, and I remain befuddled by consciousness, right? So,
Like
Michael,
everybody
you talked
else.
about the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is, how is it possible that transfer of sodium, potassium, and other ions across membranes can lead to the subjective experience of me looking at you? Like, I open my eyes and I'm surrounded by this 3D movie. Where's the movie coming from? It's not playing in my head because nobody's watching anything in my head. All I have are patterns of electricity, and yet I have the subjective experience. We cannot sort of say, oh yeah, like that doesn't matter because it's the only thing we have, right? Now, here's something remarkable that happened as I went discovering about what neural networks can do, is I got further and further about explaining what we do, what we think, explaining what we perceive, not by relying on consciousness, but by relying on the flow of activation in neural networks. I just want to underline this point because it's not obvious. It's like we can account for memory. We can think about how memory forms, how we can think about how knowledge forms. We can think about how mental brain disease happens. We can think about how we do math, even poetry and writing, right? We can think about how emotions happen by tracing activations, right? And this was a astounding discovery to me, that what feels like it's entirely dependent on consciousness is actually relying on activations in a neural network. And what Jay is referring to is this idea that, boy, some patterns of activation, stable attractor states, long lasting, typically involving prior knowledge as well as what the input is, often correspond to conscious experience. Now, that is not an explanation of consciousness. And nobody has an explanation of consciousness. People have theories about what functions of consciousness are, but nobody has, like, how do you get from ion transferring across membrane to conscious experience? What we do have is I think, an extraordinary account of how far you can get without relying on that conscious experience.
Yeah, last I saw, there was like 20 different theories to explain the hard problem of consciousness. To me, here's how I think about it, that, the kind of stuff that you guys are doing is to solve the so-called easy problem, which is not easy at all, but that, how do the wires work, the networks work? But the hard problem is asking a different question. What's it like to be a neural network? How could you possibly know? What's it like to be a bat? How would I know? If I knew what it was like to be a bat, I would just be a bat. I wouldn't be a little homunculus in there going, oh, this is what it's like to be a bat. That is not going to happen.
Not only do we not know what it's like to be a bat, I don't know what it's like to be you.
That's right.
I know Jay for over a decade. I don't know what it's like to be Jay, right? So all we could do is
I bet you have some inkling about it.
all we could do is ask each other and talk to each other, right? And
yes.
That's sort of led to the Turing test, which is,
yes.
I'll have to determine intelligence just by talking to that intelligent agent.
Yes, the other minds problem. How would you know if Data is a person on Star Trek, or if Watson, the IBM computer that won Jeopardy? I asked the what's his name, the guy at IBM that designed him, David Ferrucci. That was Watson excited and happy that he won Jeopardy? It's like he doesn't even know he's playing Jeopardy. It's not even a he.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Right. So, okay, another analogy for you on this emergence. Economists would not study, let's say, inflation or unemployment by studying the individual shopping behavior of people, right? I mean, it's a higher order network of systems together that leads to inflation or unemployment or whatever.
Yes, and that's actually really extremely relevant to neural networks, because the number of neurons that are actually involved in any particular cognitive or perceptual experience or act is vast, right? There's 86 billion neurons in the brain. Somehow or other, that's the agreed number that people usually cite. That's billions. Okay, that's a lot. of neurons. And even in, one small part of the brain, there'll still be like 100 million neurons. When something begins to produce a pattern of activation over those 100 million neurons, it's involving maybe only 5% of them, but that's still 5 million neurons in any one experiential a pattern that we might experience. So in our little word perception model, there was a unit for each letter and a unit for the whole word. Those are proxies for these patterns of activation over very large populations of neurons. Everybody now accepts that in the field of neuroscience, right? That was this huge transition that occurred, partially influenced by Hopfield's work showing, like saying, hey, look, a memory could be a pattern of activation, and the knowledge behind that memory could be the changes in the strengths of the units between them. He got physicists interested in thinking about that by posing this way of thinking. Other psychologists had already been thinking that way, but he framed it in a way that ignited a lot more enthusiasm. But this notion that an experience is a pattern of activity is that's probably distributed over many, many parts of your brain at the same time. So not just that 5 million in one part of the visual cortex, but 5 million neurons in each of many, many other parts of the brain at the same time, is, no one neuron is important for that, right? You could lose 10% of the neurons and it would hardly make any difference at all. And we have models that represent our the way we think a concept is represented in the brain as a pattern of activation. And we think about the process that occurs when a person loses their conceptual knowledge as being the process whereby these neurons are successively dying gradually. And the thing is that the disease process that results from that is a gradual progressive disease. It gradually makes it so these concepts are less and less robust, less and less differentiated for each other. And eventually the patient has no concepts at all, but it's a graded and continuous process so that, it's never about the individual neuron. It's always about the population and, the robustness of that population. So if I think about the Battle of Gettysburg this way, to use an analogy, there's a bunch of Confederate soldiers on one side of this big field. There's a bunch of Union soldiers on a ridge on the other side. These Confederate soldiers tried to charge across this field to take the ridge on the other side. And all these Union soldiers, like 10,000 of them on the other side, are firing at these 10,000 Confederate soldiers. But the thing is that the Confederate soldiers are standing in the open field while these guys are shooting at them with all these bullets, right? So it's overdetermined that these guys are all going to get mowed down by all these bullets flying at them. And you can't attribute the causality to any one Union soldier or any one Confederate soldier. It's just in the statistics of the whole situation where all those bullets are overwhelming all these poor Confederate soldiers who are charging under the orders of Robert E. Lee across the field. And it's the same way with the neurons in our brain. No one of them is responsible for anything, really. It's all...
Well, your cover has the flock of birds.
Yes, exactly.
And no one bird is just following the herd in front of it.
I sometimes think that cover may not necessarily communicate all the ideas of the book, but that's one that it tries to capture.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, then how do you explain the so-called grandmother neuron, or as Christoph Koch calls it, the Jennifer Aniston neuron from the patient?
That Jennifer Aniston neuron was discovered 25 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, so but obviously upon that as Jennifer Aniston's image.
Christoph come and argue with me about that if you will.
Well, okay, think about it this way. If we represented ideas with one unit, one neuron, then we'd be so sensitive to the loss of that neuron. Like if my grandmother was one neuron, and if something happened to that neuron, my grandmother, all knowledge about my grandmother would be gone. That's a big problem. Another big problem is that when I examine the world, I want to make concepts about it, right? Dogs are furry creatures with 4 legs and a tail. And I want similar things to have similar representations. So when I think of the word sofa and when I think of the word couch, I want to have similar neural activation. It would be very odd if one neuron represented sofa, one neuron represented couch, and one neuron represented the idea of the number 3. I mean, you have to have similar things having similar patterns. So this idea of representing ideas over a population of units allows for similarities, and it allows for concepts, right? This is the beauty of getting away from the grandmother neuron, which is, and it's a simple idea, and it took me a long time to understand it. It's like, oh, once we have this, we've got concepts, and we couldn't in a really deep way have similarity based concepts that rely on intersections between individual experiences come about if we didn't have these populations of neurons representing them.
Yeah. So obviously the electrical stimulation of this one neuron that triggers in the patient's brain, the image of Jennifer Aniston, is connected to multiple neural networks higher and higher up till it gets to visual cortex or whatever. And so that would be an example of your, I don't know what you call it, nested networks. And then are there networks that represent lower order, simpler networks, which represent lower order, and it's kind of scaling all the way up to, I don't know, the outside cortex or something?
We start with a story about Hubel and Wiesel, who won the Nobel Prize, and they were busy implanting electrodes in cat's visual cortex, and they were looking for neurons that responded to, say, the picture of another cat or a rat or maybe cat food, and they didn't find any of these neurons. Like, they'd show pictures and they want the neuron to fire. I mean, what do cats care about? So they didn't have computers at that time, and one day the slide out of the projector gets stuck, and there's a dark line on the screen. And one of the neurons that is hooked up to their electrode starts firing, like bing, 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 right? And so there's this beautiful discovery that, oh, okay, there's maybe this line detector is happening. And they start investigating, and they say, okay, maybe we have dot detectors that detect patterns of light, and then if some of them fire together, this line detector happens, and so in very early parts of the visual cortex, we have simpler recognition of items. And as those items, so once you have a line and another line, you could conceive of conceptually you having a square, maybe a cube. And that's not exactly how it works in the brain, but this idea of having simple things that detected, which then working together to recognize increasingly complex things, is a hierarchical system that the brain follows. And what I love about this is, like, this kind of way of understanding is mechanistic. It's not appealing to magic, right? So your audience cares about being skeptical as a stance in life, which I also deeply care about. Is this, okay, Feynman wrote on his board, it was like, if I can't build it, I don't understand it, or words to that effect. And so what Hubel and Wiesel and neural networks are doing, they're tracing, like, okay, if we have this, then we can have this, and then we can recognize a line, we can recognize a branch of a tree, and now we can recognize the whole tree, and boy, color is coming in, and it's this hierarchical buildup, and you can trace it.
So Michael, I don't want to cut Gaurav off, but I would like to use this opportunity to begin to make a bridge to computational neuroscience and artificial intelligence. The history of research on the visual pathway that supports object recognition is quite extensive, and begins with Hubel and Wiesel, but with other people recording from successively deeper into the brain sort of areas that are now understood to be partially organized in a series, although with some skipping connections and so on. And people would record, and what they would find in their recording studies was that at the lowest levels, there were these very literal sort of edges that were tied to very specific points in space. But even within the same brain area, there'll be neurons that aren't as tied as closely to specific points in space, that sort of seem to be like saying, oh, there's an edge in this orientation anywhere in this little patch. And then that gets propagated to the next layer up. Well, that turns out to be the architecture that's implemented in the convolutional neural network that Jeff Hinton and Sutskever and Krzyzewski, used to create an artificial neural network that turned out to be a game changer for the field of machine pattern recognition. Right, so it's organized along the lines of the structure of this sequence of stages in the visual pathway, but with these notions that at the lowest levels, the neurons are going to respond to pretty literal and localized features. And as you go up, the neurons are collecting information from a larger and larger region of space, but responding more specifically to a pattern that occurs wherever it might be within a broader region of space. And that was discovered from recordings in the brain before it was actually implemented in the artificial neural networks that are then these models that, are the things that AI uses for recognizing, classifying photographs and pictures of things. There's a common structure between the brain and these artificial networks. It's not a perfect correspondence. The brain involves lots of feedback that is usually left out, for example, in the artificial neural networks, but there's a sufficient degree of correspondence here that it's really worth taking note of the fact that the architecture that our brain uses and the primitive elements that our brain uses are very, very similar to the architecture and primitive elements that are used in artificial neural networks to do the best job we know how to do in things like object recognition. So it's like this is a way of like convincing skeptics who think, oh, artificial neural networks, they're not really as cognitive or symbolic as they need to be. But this is, this kind of thing is showing us that they can capture better than anything else we know how to build, how this process occurs.
Well, okay, so that does bring up the question of, what Stephen Hawking and Leonard Malone now call model-dependent realism in their book, The Grand Design. That is to say, we have models of the physical world. We're not 100% sure that this is the way the world actually is, but it's the best we have for making predictions and so on. So I guess, applying it to what you just said, the question then is, are computer scientists working on AI and eventually AGI, are they along the right path to creating something like human level intelligence and consciousness and so on? Or is it just a model and maybe they will, maybe they won't? And maybe this is the way the brain works. Maybe this is not the way the brain works.
Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think that it's not their goal to do so.
Okay.
Their goal is to make money for Google or
yes,
OpenAI stockholders.
Of course.
Okay. They are not concerned with modeling the brain. I am.
Yeah.
There is a general point here, right? So for many years, people did try to build these symbolic systems in artificial intelligence, right? I mean, when I came back to do my PhD, as I said, in midlife, there was a lot of noise. Yeah, there was some stuff going on with the kinds of networks that Jay is describing with image recognition, but there was also a lot of emphasis on symbolic rule-based systems that if this happens, do that. And the fact is that didn't work, right? I mean, that didn't work. And what I'm really struck by is there's such a renewed interest in neural networks. And neural networks underpin the brain, as Jay said, they also underpin artificial intelligence. And I think it's a beautiful theory, right? I'm much more concerned with the eternal questions of who we are and what makes us do the things that we do. It's a beautiful theory. And had it not been for artificial intelligence, the astounding success of artificial intelligence and the renewed emphasis on neural networks, it's possible that neural network ideas about the brain would have been noticed by a few people, but not really caught fire the way they have because of artificial intelligence. So I'm in that sense very grateful for artificial intelligence to reveal the extraordinary power of emergence from simple connecting units, because they also tell us to focus on our understanding of neural networks for understanding ourselves. And it's the same neural network. And to me, that's why these fields have a lot to do with each other. And artificial intelligence of the future should look to the solutions of the brain, just as people who study the brain should look at innovations coming from artificial intelligence. They have a common framework.
Yeah.
The common framework is the neural network.
Well, here's the problem you present in the book. These are ambiguous figures, or you might call them ambiguous neural networks or conflicting neural networks. The famous one of the little mouse that could be an old man, or the seal/donkey, or the cat, where the H could be, the H and the A are the exact same structure, figure. So what's happening there where your brain is like toggling back and forth, the old man, young man, whatever, where you can't quite make it out? Are these just conflicting networks and they can't make a decision because it's too ambiguous?
So there's a lot of work on that in neuroscience, where people record simultaneously or sometimes at different days in different parts of the brain, but where it's possible to correlate, what the neurons are doing in different brain areas with what the experiential state of a participant is. And it's putative in the case of a monkey. We can't say the monkey's conscious of it, but the monkey reports that by pressing a button, you say, oh, I'm seeing this stimulus now, or I'm seeing this stimulus now. 2/3 of the time, you know which stimulus it is. And when it's the stimulus it is, the monkey's reporting it correctly. So then when it's ambiguous and he goes back and forth, you can see how that's related to what the neurons in the brain are doing at the same time. And the fascinating thing that was found in those studies was that they recorded in several parts of the visual pathway, in different days perhaps, but they found neurons in several different parts of the visual pathway while these perceptual alternations were occurring in these monkeys. And the general finding was that in all the areas they recorded, some of the neurons tracked just what the stimulus was on the screen, but others of the neurons tracked with the experience that the monkey was reporting. So as the monkey is about to move to the switch his button, he's pressing to the other button, that set of neurons switched their activity to the state that was appropriate for that. And I've always thought of this in terms of this massively distributed interactive process between all of these different brain areas where there's some sort of bottom-up, sort of ground truth, sort of substrate that's there, but then there's this cooperative sort of like trying to make sense of it through this parallel and distributed interactive process that is distributed over multiple brain areas. And, it settles into one of these states or another. And that's related to this idea I was sharing with you before about when a state is like persistent and dwelling before the mind. It's like what we're perceiving. How does that relate to the fundamental question? Well, it certainly ties what's going on in the nervous system to a measure that is putatively and seems sensibly to imagine is correlated with experience. And it tells us that probably monkeys are having experience too, right? And I certainly share that view. And so I think that with this kind of research, we gradually get to have a clearer and clearer picture of, the nature of the biological substrate. And we have this ability to capture that more and more faithfully with models that, can simulate those kinds of findings.
Well, that's one of those big questions. The substrate.
I want to say something about that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
So you're pointing to a figure that is the same figure in the word the, T-H-E, and in the word cat, it's the same figure. And the point of your example is that we read the first one as an H and the second one as an A. And what this illustrates for me is the extraordinary power of context. That is, it's not some things flipping back and forth. It's like we understand things based on context. And this is a personal thought of mine, which is I think it's all context. That is, there is bottom-up input in the world from the world, and it's interacting with what we know and what we expect. And what we recognize something as depends on both things. And here, the words T and E are context for that central letter, which we say is an H. And the words C and T are context for that central letter, which we say is an A. So it's us making sense of things, not only based on that item by item perception, but in context of what we know about the world. So
back to my earlier question there. So there's some simple neural networks that process letters, and then there's a higher order network that processes the letters around the letters that are ambiguous, and that shifts the decision to this one or that one.
Well, I would say slightly differently. I would say that the network is multiple layers, okay, and that at the lower layers, the letters are processed semi-independently, but at the higher level, there's an aggregation, and there's feedback back from that higher level back down. So as these two layers are reciprocally processing and interacting with each other, the bottom-up input is working with the higher layer, and the higher layer knows that there's a word that's made out of the letters T-H-E. There's a unit for that in our simple model from back in the 70s. Or a distributed pattern for that in other models that are at that level of description. But it's the same basic idea, and I think it's a fundamental point that these processes are going on in a way that's mutually constraining, so that the higher level and the lower level are co-determining their states with each other. And that's a very important part of this whole notion of, like the emergent sort of, or we talk about attractor states in neural networks. Those are states that are stable because the neurons are reciprocally mutually supportive of each other. And that reciprocal mutual support gives rise to this perception. It is the case in the brain, in the visual pathway at least, and other people argue in many other parts that lower layers are more sort of point by point, like either in time, very fine-grained time steps, or in space, very fine granularity of space. And higher level is more integration across time or space, depending on whether it's the auditory system or the visual system, so that the integrative population at the higher level is mutually connected to the more part-based population at the lower level, supporting this recurrent sort of persistence of the representation of the whole and the parts simultaneously.
Yeah. Well, so back to the AGI problem and substrate independence that I mentioned, are the designers at Tesla that are trying to perfect self-driving cars, are they on the right track? I'm a pretty good driver. I can in real time adjust ambiguous things like rocks in the road and swerve, or that it's a child in this crosswalk. And the Tesla doesn't do that as well yet. You could just watch the videos online of them mowing down, dummy children in the crosswalk or whatever. But so there's a debate, because I follow this. Some people go, they just have to upload more images and more data, and then they'll be as good as a human brain at detecting these ambiguous information coming in. Or no, they're on the wrong track completely, because this isn't how the human brain works. Your thoughts?
There's a deeply entrenched debate about all of these things, and my own position on this is that we definitely have a long way to go before we will fully understand how our brains are solving these problems. And once we learn more about exactly how our brains are solving those problems, it will be information, and they will certainly exploit it as fast as they possibly can. But as Rob was talking, they will want to be listening to neuroscience as soon as anything useful is discovered there. I do, in my part-time relationship with Google DeepMind, I find myself sometimes frustrated because I'm wanting to study these things that the models, seem out of scope for what the models can get to today. And everybody's like, no, we have to be ahead of OpenAI in the next business cycle, And so we don't get a chance outside of academia as much as I would like to imagine that we get to explore these questions about how the brain is really solving the problem.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why I think there's real value in preserving, academic institutions and keeping their independence, while also tremendous value in the engineering that's being done that's exploiting these ideas as fast as possible when they come along. And so, driving our understanding. I wouldn't be affiliated with Google myself if it wasn't for the fact that I thought that I am learning a tremendous amount about how to think about how the brain solves these problems by watching people or really trying to get the engineering solution to work. And that's something that Alan Newell used to say. It's like, okay, you guys have psychological principles, but show me how you build a machine that does it, and then we'll talk.
Yeah.
So the synergy of these two goals is powerful, but it's not the immediate goal of AI to solve the brain problem or the immediate goal of neuroscience to solve the AI problem. And I like to think maybe I help to provide a little bit of a bridge between these two.
They run
and
parallel.
Our book will do some of that. So
Gaurav, let's go back to neural network models and explain memory for us. Where is memory stored? How does it come back to memory from some event? Why is it flawed? I mean, it's not a video recording that you rewatch on the Cartesian theater of your mind, right? You talk about Elizabeth Loftus' work. You can change people's memories by just asking the question a different way. How fast were the cars traveling when they collided versus when they smashed into each other? People remember different things. How is that possible, and how do you explain that?
So it's interesting, Michael, the example that you had earlier about the same letter being an H and an A depending on context applies to these Elizabeth Loftus experiments. So you show the same video and you say, how fast were the cars going when they crashed into each other? People will come up with a higher number than if you say, how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other? So once again, it's context influencing how our judgments. Now, the question is, what is a memory really, right? So in the neural network framework, a connection between units represents the knowledge of the system. So when there is a new memory formed, things that weren't connected before are getting connected. But importantly, memory is not a lookup. It's not like a file drawer that you can say, okay, underneath this. It's again this mutual constraint satisfaction problem. It depends on what the connections are, what the input that you're getting is, meaning how the question is asked, and how that activation is flowing through the pipes that represent the knowledge of the system, right? So when we have experiences, when we learn things in the neural network model, we are forming connections. And these connections represent the knowledge of the system. Now, this connects very much to your previous question about, well, gee, are we going about this the right way or the wrong way when we think about artificial intelligence? Well, the learning system, which is the new connection formation system, in most neural networks, is something called backpropagation that relies on making an error and then fix or changing existing connection weights so that it makes it less likely to make the same error. Now, that's made these AI systems very, very they make connections, they change connections based on input and output data. There are really good reasons to believe that that's not the same mechanisms how humans learn. Humans learn with a lot less data, with a lot less energy. So it's the same connection formation, but the algorithm for the connection formation is different in humans and machines. And that is one of the great, I think, frontiers that beckon us, which is how exactly our brain's doing it. And gee, can we use some of that thinking in the systems of the future? And I think that's an extraordinarily important question.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the neural networks themselves follow the Donald Hebb's Hobbesian model of neurons that fire together, wire together. Your networks are wiring together, essentially firing together and wiring together. And then our networks wiring with each other and on up the scale such that you have these massively complex networks that are changing with experience themselves.
Absolutely. So, in the brain, neurons in a particular brain region have these dendritic trees that you showed the picture of. And they also have collateral outputs that go back into the neighboring dendritic trees. So they interact with their immediate neighbor in a very dense sort of fabric of mutual influence. They also have axons that come out and go to other brain areas, and there's almost always reciprocal connections coming back the other way from the downstream area. So there's bidirectional connectivity between distant areas and local bidirectional connectivity within areas. There's obviously much denser connectivity within areas. Those long distance wires are very costly. They take up a lot of volume in the brain. And so they tend to be a lot sparser. But I think of the brain as a whole as a sort of a massively interconnected system. And those wires are set up in such a way as to make it so that the transmission delays between different parts of the brain are very, very low. So that means that the brain can essentially be doing a coordinated computation across multiple brain areas simultaneously, both within and between these different areas. And fully understanding how the updating of the connection strings works and is really something, as Gaurav said, that we're new discoveries are actually being made that change the way we think about Hebb's rule that you were just describing. And there's very active debate in the field about that nowadays. So we don't fully understand how the brain is actually doing these things, but we do know that it's useful to think of the brain as a mutually interconnected network where multiple brain areas are always simultaneously influencing each other in many, many ways.
Well, you guys talk about Descartes a little bit. Just to be clear, you are not dualists, I gather. You are monists. There's no mind separate from the brain itself, whatever the networks are in the brain, but it's still brain.
I am skeptical of the dualist view.
You are? Okay.
And I'm, by predilection and thought, very much inclined to use neural networks to understand aspects of human behavior, human thought, and human emotion.
Yeah.
The Cartesian dualistic perspective related to several different distinctions at the same time. It related to the distinction between the sensory and motor systems and the part of the brain that thinks. It related to a difference between humans and animals. And it related to this sort of nature of the thing itself, this sort of, divine inspiration that interfaced with that physical system at some particular place he postulated in the brain. And when we use recordings in animals to inform our theories of cognition in humans, as many, many people do in fields like vision, that not so much language, because monkeys don't have much language, but it feels like vision, cognitive decision-making and control, memory. We are saying, no, we're not going to we're not going to go with that bifurcation between these two. And when we say what we learn from what happens in sensory systems and try to apply it to thinking about what might be happening when we're actually doing logical thought, we're also breaking that kind of bifurcation, right? So it's a bifurcation that applies in several different kinds of ways. And I think for me, the really transformative moment of my education was when my teacher in my sensory physiology class when I was an undergraduate explained how my perceptual experience could be accounted for by a neural circuit that was found in the eyeball of a horseshoe crab. Okay, so this is breaking all of this at the same time. It's a very sensory thing. It's in the peripheral nervous system, but it's explaining this perceptual experience that I'm having in my mind when I look at this stimulus, right? And that is what made me, I mean, it's at least one formative experience that contributed to me wanting to think, okay, it all arises from these principles of how these neurons work and wire with each other and give rise to sort of an emergent phenomenon by virtue of their interconnections that is going to turn out to be the place that it's really useful to focus when we try to understand what underlies our experience and our behavior.
Okay, I'm 70 years old now. I have just kind of dim memories of high school and college and my 20s, but I have lots of photo albums and boxes of stuff that when I go through it, the memories come flooding back. So where were they? Where were those memories?
Well, as we talked about earlier, the knowledge of a system, including the system of your brain, is in the connections. Now, these connections are there with repeated use, the connection or experience, related experience, these connections can be strengthened. And with less use, they can be weakened, right? These connections are dynamic. Now, that connection is in your brain. That connection of, let's say, your prom night is there. Those connections representing that friend or that person you took to the prom, all of that is there. The input of the photograph is creating this activation pattern in your brain that relies on those connections. Now, sometimes these connections fade to the point we might look at a picture and say, I don't remember the person's name or who is that on the corner, right? The important thing to take away is that our thoughts are patterns of activation that start with the input and are constrained by the knowledge, meaning our connections, right? So I know Jay was talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, right? I know a lot about the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, where do these connections live? In these connections are when Jay says 10,000, Union people, and I can picture Cemetery Ridge, and these are connections between soldiers, this battlefield, Pickett's Charge, and whatnot, and these are activated by the input of somebody talking or a photograph, and then are producing thoughts related to that memory, which are patterns of activation.
Nice. Well, Gaurav, you're talking about, a picture bringing back memories. There's a Black Mirror episode starring Paul Giamatti, who's going through some old photos of his sweetheart from college or whatever it was. And, through a series of little steps there, he ends up in contact with this AI company that you send them the photo or you scan it and send them the photo, and they send you this little device to put on it's always on the temporal lobe, right? That then reconstructs from the photo a three-dimensional, and you put these goggles on and you go into the photograph. You're actually and there's your sweetheart and you're interacting with her. And so this sounds pretty, sci-fi, but I'll tell you a funny story. So last Monday, I did a public event with Steven Pinker at a book signing for his new book in LA. Okay. So this photo was taken by just a friend in the audience. Okay. So she takes that photo and puts it into Grok and instructs Grok to make them dance. So here it is. Okay, this never happened. Right? So now you can't see very well here, but it's as sharp as could be. It looks absolutely like it's totally real. We're already there. I mean, this is kind of scary. Like, how would you know that never happened?
Well, I think it's a nuanced picture. I want to be careful about we're already there, because the Black Mirror thing you're talking about is about implanting a memory, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, as we've discussed, memories involve connections. And as we've discussed, connections involve learning, like how do you hook up these neurons? And we made progress. I don't think we understand exactly the mechanisms by which the brain incorporates inputs and forms new connections. And we've got algorithms that do a similar thing, because AI systems do this. AI systems learn from experience. So that's one thing that's missing in implanting this false memory. The second thing I want to, AI is the current instantiation of AI is really good at some things, because it's a pattern completer. So it's got a pattern in which it has Michael and Steven sitting in chairs, and it has a pattern of dancing, and it can complete certain patterns. So yes, extraordinary progress, which I wouldn't have believed 5-6 years ago. No, that's still far away. But that's different from this notion of implanting realities and implanting memories. I am not arguing that there's something deeply mysterious about that, and that couldn't possibly happen. Just that we don't exactly know how to do that. And that human brains have a lot of things which AI systems don't. We have goals, and it's useful to think about where goals come from. They come often from our bodies and neuromodulators. And emotions are richly body-centric experiences, and those contribute to our goals. And these things are sitting there completing patterns, right? And in an extraordinary way, and they share many commonalities. It's a nuanced story. It's easy to get, oh, it's almost there, it's smarter than us. Oh, it's really stupid, it's doing nothing, it's making... And neither of those things is true. It's an extraordinary human creation. It is unlike the human mind. And there's oceans more to go.
We end the book actually with this section where we discuss, all the things we don't know about the human brain that will inform AI when we figure them out, about how the biological brain solves the problem.
Are you familiar with a concept called terminal lucidity, or sometimes called paradoxical lucidity? The data on this is pretty much anecdotal, but these are people that are pretty much infirm, dementia, senility, Alzheimer's, and right at the end of their life, like within hours of death, supposedly memories and language comes flooding back. They recognize the people in the room. They talk to the people in the room. So we're told. So the argument made by dualists and people that believe in the afterlife and so on is like, memories are not just stored in the brain. You need the brain because it's like a radio, but they're out there in the quantum field somewhere, or they're elsewhere. Now, setting that aside, the dualism part, is it possible that the memories are in there, and that the stress or the medications they're giving the patients or whatever brings the memories back from wherever they were, much like seeing a photo and like, oh, now I remember this?
It's certainly true that the states, that our brains go through many different kinds of states. And when we're awake, we're in sort of one set of states. When we're sleeping, we're in a different set of states. But there's a whole set of different states in both waking and sleep that we don't fully understand yet. And I'm like myself, not immune to thinking that the state of some sort of incipient release from life that is somehow putting you in a place that you're not usually at could release, certain kinds of patterns that had previously been inaccessible or weren't as accessible in some of those other states. I'm obviously not giving an exact description of exactly how that could happen yet, but that would be the way I would begin to approach it, right? And if we think about the states that we go through many different sleep states. We have actually dreaming apparently in many of these different sleep states. These dreams are kind of different, but the brain is continuously replaying previous experiences, sometimes on a time scale that's too fast to recognize that it's happening. And sometimes on a more explicit cognitive timescale, like I'm playing out, what would happen if I did do this, and I think about it at the behavioral timescale. But in my mind, all these little tiny events are happening that are always like projecting out, like imagining Picker and that guy dancing subliminally in your mind. And the neural networks are doing something pretty similar to that, really.
Yeah. Well, right. The part of dreaming that just rehearses memories of the day, okay, that's obvious. But the parts of dreaming that's just completely fantasy, just hallucinating, just making stuff up, which we also do. Is that just random firing of networks?
Well, so you talk about terminal lucidity, Michael. So I want to say something. When I hear something about quantum and memories in the ether, and I want my longing is for how. What is your claim exactly, right? Now, the claim that knowledge is represented in the connections is something that matches, say, an account of when an Alzheimer's patient who doesn't remember their partner's face can nevertheless respond to songs from their youth, right?
Mm.
You can at least imagine a story that's based on connections, because those are different connections that are being preserved with different outputs that are tapping into neuromodulator systems. You can develop a how model. My way of looking at the human experience is to start with this longing for a how. And what's extraordinary about the work that Jay and others have done in neural networks, and I've also contributed to, is that this framework can do a lot. And for me, from out, I came to the field later. It's as if the Darwinists come up with the origin of species. And then there's a lot of people who haven't read the book and have these wild ideas about giraffes getting longer necks because they're extending towards higher leaves, right? So I want to start with the how, and I hope that people who read the book have this notion that, boy, there's a lot of wonder in the answers that are already there.
Yeah. Well, so another ancillary problem I've addressed is the scientific search for immortality. I wrote a book about this, Heavens on Earth. One of it is the mind uploaders. These are the people like, Ray Kurzweil and others that they could, at some point, we could scan the connectome, much like the genome of the brain, where you have every single synaptic connection in the brain. And that's your memory self. And then you digitize the file and you upload it in the cloud and you're up there. I have lots of problems with this because it's not you up there. It's just a copy of you. And in any case, you would then start living a different life than the original you and so on. But the entire thing is based on a theory of memory, that the memories are physically encoded in these synaptic, these little synaptic connections. And you can see them on the electron microscope and so on. And even though we can't do this now, in principle, if you scanned every single synaptic connection, this is their argument. So the argument is that, like in a certain type of surgery, like the heart-lung transplant, they cool the brain, the whole body and brain down to, it's not even functioning. It's not dead, but it's just so cold. There's no molecular exchanges or whatever. And then they bring the person back online after the surgery and their memories are back there. So their argument is that the memories are physically stored. So if you could copy the connection of the physical system and make a file of it, then that's you.
But it's not just the synapses, because there are rich brain body connections, right? I mean, why do we respond to music? Why do we fall in love? I mean, we have rich connections and interactive connections with the body. So in principle, if you could get every synapse and get every brain body connection, there's no, if you're a monist, then you don't get to claim that no, the in principle can't be done. You do get to claim, however, that it's an extraordinarily computationally intensive problem, and replicating that computational intensity would need evolutionary time. I mean, it took evolution billions of years to get to us, and there's a lot of computational puzzles that were addressed along the way.
Last couple of big questions here, since this is in your subtitle, how intelligence arises in people and machines. All right, what do you mean by intelligence?
I would say that intelligence is the ability to respond in constructive, goal-directed, and purposive ways to situations. And it's something that, evolution brought forth upon our planet in a very, very extended process, starting with very, very primitive organisms that could follow, gradients of concentration of chemicals to move their way towards, sources of nutrients, and that, gradually became more and more complex through a very, very extended process. So it's something that is intrinsically adaptive to an environment, and something that arose on our planet out of the confluence of the many, many affordances that being exact right distance from a sun, and having, an atmosphere and oceans full of water, and the wonderful array of chemical resources that we have on Earth, and the right temperature and so on, for all these processes to occur. And I like to think that an aspect of intelligence is actually beyond the individual and in the cultural context in which we are all immersed, that gives rise to our more advanced cognitive abilities. So, we think of humans as like, okay, there's this biological species that's going to have these capabilities. The human that's raised in in an environment where they get a chance to go to the best schools and, learn from the people who have done all this amazing thinking in the past before them, are in some sense much more intelligent than the others who haven't had those opportunities. And I think that, so intelligence is a response to experience that adapts our behavior in constructive and productive ways.
Nice.
If I could add just one thing, Michael, like the reason I think we both hesitate in answering your question is many concepts such as intelligence, emotion, love, a chair, they defy a definition. We know it when we see examples of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you ask me what is intelligence, I would tell you about the ability to navigate a maze, the ability to see a tree and call it a tree, the ability to compose music, the ability to make a decision based on your prior decision, the ability to incorporate knowledge, the ability to pay attention. These are aspects of intelligence, right? And these are the central concerns of our book. And many of these aspects of intelligence are also arising in machines. And I think it's a trap when one gets a psychological construct and says, okay, well, tell me exactly what the thing is. It's like the Supreme Court justice said about porn. He knows it when he sees it, without necessarily defining.
Well, yeah. So that's Wittgenstein's, the problem of a game. What's a game? Define a game.
Yeah.
Well, I could give you examples of games, but it's hard to come up with a specific definition that you couldn't find an exception to, right? So
that's exactly.
And yet we still navigate the world using concepts, family resemblances. I know when I see one.
And distributed representations are great for understanding what's going on there. I mean,
what is that?
My training was in mathematics, right?
Oh.
I was so puzzled because my mental model was we have a computing engine. And so like, how come my computing engine is not able to give clear definitions? Like, how can I use a chair without knowing what a chair is, or a game without knowing? Well, the answer is these things are fuzzy and graded and constrained by input and prior knowledge.
Yeah. Okay. System 1, system 2 thinking conceptually, does that map onto your network model?
I think for me, the terminology there is misleading, because it's as though there's two different systems in our minds. And I think that whenever I'm engaged in some extended thought process, I'm using the same mind that I'm using when I'm engaging in a abrupt and sort of immediate reaction to something. I'm not saying that the processes are all required to be exactly the same in those two circumstances, but it's not the case that there's a rational me and this other reactive me. It's that the reactive me is being, kind of a little bit shaped and constrained when I sort of step back and try to think more carefully than when I'm sort of just reacting impulsively to a situation. So I like to think of it as responding method 1 or responding method 2, where, I can give a knee-jerk response to something, or I could reflect on it for a little bit and sort of play out certain alternatives in my mind before coming up with an answer. But in both cases, I'm using the same mind to do this. And so I like to think in terms of the idea that there are systems that help control and shape and direct the flow of activation through the pathways of other parts of the brain. And that, system 2 is more associated with circumstances where those other parts are playing a stronger role in shaping the outcome of processing, rather than that there's, two me's inside of me.
So you would apply that then also to myopic time discounting in the future. My current self is one way, my future self is going to be different. So I have to set up the situation now because I know tomorrow I'm going to be sleepy. So I set out my workout clothes tonight. So I'm
yeah, so tomorrow. This gets to the control issue, right? So Michael, it's undoubtedly true that the conscious experience of what Kahneman called system 1 is different from the conscious experience system 2. Like we feel like we're slow and deliberate, and we feel like controlled, and we feel like there's impulses rising, and we feel like maybe we're controlling them. So there is that feeling difference in these, what he labeled 2 modules. I think what Jay is saying, and I certainly agree with and want to amplify on, is that it's the same system that is producing these 2 outputs. It's not 2 different systems. It's not this Platonist, there's the charioteer and there's the wild horses and there's one side of the emotional brain, which is deep inside. All of these are interacting systems, and these systems come online depending on the context of the situation. If you asked me to multiply 824 by 92 and my life depends on it, the systems that will come online will engage control and rechecking. And if you ask me to quickly say what rhymes with brown, I'd come up with clown, because, so it's the context shapes the kinds of things the neural networks does. We humans some humans classify some of these behaviors as impulsive or time discount related or system 1, system 2. But the view that we're putting forward is that these things are understandable. Even our mathematical achievements are understandable as interactions within the same neural network.
And how do you answer the big free will determinism or compatibilism question? If your system, all these networks are mechanical and seemingly deterministic, where does decision, volition, choice, whatever words you want to use, come from?
Yeah, I have 2 answers to this. So one is that our system is incredibly complex. And so while it is deterministic, we certainly put forward the view that we want to understand the system is deterministic. It's a complex system. And it's not like we have availability or accessibility, or other people have availability or accessibility to all the variables that are shaping our behavior. That's point number 1. That's a lot easier point. Point number 2, which I think is the real point, is that we humans have the ability to set goals and pursue them. Right? I mean, when we talk about free will, really, that's what we're talking about. Now, when we talk about it in the philosophical domain, it's like, can we arbitrarily do something? I don't even know what that arbitrary means. Like, right? I don't understand what that philosophical notion of free. What I want to say is, what's extraordinary is that we can understand how goals are. We can start to understand how goals are set. We can understand what kinds of things happen when we follow goals. And that's all we want from free will, really. Right? Yes, we are deterministic systems. Yes, I mean, the quantum physicists will disagree, but the large parts of the universe appears to be deterministic. There's no loss of majesty in that. What do we want from free will? We want to set our goals and follow them. And there's a lot of evidence that we can do that.
Yeah, I agree. Jay?
Yeah, I have a very different answer to this. I think it's completely complementary. I don't say it's contradicting at all, but I think that the concept of free will exists in society as a construct that allows us to hold each other accountable for our behavior. And that when we attribute the ability to make decisions to other organisms that are under their control, that means that they have to be held responsible. That means that we can hold them responsible for those decisions. And I think it's actually very closely related to what Skinner was on about, right? If we hold organisms accountable for their behavior because there's contingencies based on what they do, it will influence what they do. And I think, therefore, that construct is one that we should understand as arising from a social need to have it rather than from the idea that it actually exists as such.
Yeah, well, certainly those both matter. The way I think about it is, could you have done otherwise? Well, if you're just rewinding the tape to play back the exact same thing that happened, no, you're just going to do what you did because that's just a recording of what happened. But the universe is not, the future is not exactly the same as the past. You can't step into the same river twice. The river's not the same and you're not the same, right, Heraclitus? So, and you have the capacity to learn. Your neural networks can learn and go, well, last time when I had a similar situation to this, I went left. I'm going right this time.
Well, but that thought would have antecedents, and it would have inputs, and it would be interacting with your knowledge of left and right in the context that you're playing in. I do very much like this notion Jay just said, and I want to underline it, which is, if we look at ourselves, we want to say we're deterministic machines. If we look at how we want to construct society, free will is a very useful concept, right? I mean, I think it's antisocial to go around saying, oh, look, free will doesn't exist. No, you have to hold each other accountable. And so that's one thing. And the second thing is, I think it's a complementary idea, which is, we're saying we're deterministic, but we do have goals. And like a lot of us get meaning from pursuing our goals.
Of course.
And there are neural mechanisms that we can understand on what it means to pursue a goal.
Yeah. All right, last big question, and then we'll wrap it up here. So, we began with Hubel and Weasel poking around cats' brains, 75 years ago. And now, we have AI and self-driving cars almost, and Grok and LLMs. Maybe Ray's idea of the singularity at 2040 is, maybe a little ambitious, but certainly 2100 or 2200 or 2500, 500 years from now or whatever. Could you imagine something happening where our brains are no longer the smartest thing on the planet, and what will that mean for humanity?
Okay. let me say what I think on this. I think that it's very likely that artificial systems in our bodies will sort of change how we spot disease in body. This is almost conceivable right now, where you can have little micro robots that can identify cancer cells and so on. And I see that there is very little that should prevent us from thinking that they can be this union between biological neural networks supplemented with artificial units with their own capabilities. And so it may not be a either or question. It may not be is it the human smarter or is the brain smarter? It may be that human intelligence is furthered by artificial neural networks. I mean, I think that's certainly possible to imagine, and some aspects of that are already happening. I do want to say that I am really passionate about the idea that we are biological creatures, and there are people. Ned Block wrote an article in Intrinsic Cognitive Science this time about Maybe consciousness is limited to biological tissues. I have no opinion on that, but it's a possibility. But we are biological creatures in that our biology makes us form goals and attachments and gives us motivation, and then also gives us the cognitive means to follow our goals and motivation. And we, in our current neural networks, AI systems, are able to get to one aspect of that in parallel, sometimes exceed those cognitive abilities. But when we talk about AGI, are we talking about like a human-like organism? Because that requires a lot. I feel like we're far away from it. And I am much more, if the future, like nobody can predict the future until you get to it, but it's fun to think about possibilities. And I am intrigued by the possibility of these joint intelligences.
Nice. Jake?
I think what I'd like to share on this subject is a sense that, there's ways in which we're already there in terms of the answer to your question. So there are artificial, somewhat neural network-based systems that are now capable of, learning through self-play, how to find strategies that no human being ever discovered for playing games like chess or Go, and that it's sort of hard to imagine any sort of human being with our biological limitations, which in many ways are very different from the limitations of artificial systems, catching up with those kinds of artificial systems. So I don't think that it's like like a singularity or not. I think it's more like there's many, many ways in which machines are going to have capabilities, and there's many, many ways in which humans have capabilities. I think it's extremely likely that there won't be any particular capabilities that we have that machines can't have. Certainly in 500 years. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball about exactly when these kinds of things occurred, but acceleration has occurred in a lot of domains, and we ought to be agnostic about how long that trajectory is going to be. I just think that, somewhat complementary to Rob again, that the kinds of things that machines are going to do are going to be, things that usefully complement us. And I think that the places where people are most positive and enthusiastic about artificial systems are cases where we're focusing on that complementarity. For example, mathematicians are thinking, okay, these are tools that allow us to do these search processes to discover, a proof that nobody would have ever been able to think of. But once we find that proof, we can actually come back and use our way of thinking to understand what it means. And so the affordances that AI is providing us are complementary to our own intelligence in a lot of ways. I think my belief is that there are potential risks to allowing those systems to become completely autonomous and to have complete control over their goals. And what we need as a society and as a culture is to work together in a coordinated way to put in place systems that allow us to regulate and ameliorate the tendencies that we as people have against each other sometimes, and also that our machines could potentially have if they were allowed to escape some sort of sense of being acculturated and constrained by the global kind of context of, hey, we're all on this one planet together. We need to live together and find coexistence. So we need to be imagining that our AIs will be our friends and our complements, and putting in place mechanisms that ensure that.
Gentlemen, perfect place to end. There it is. The Emergent Mind, How Intelligence Arises in People and Machines. Great read, really important theory here you've offered. I hope it's widely read amongst your colleagues and and AI people and just readers in general.
And people interested in the world.
Oh, yeah, because you cover, I mean, you really cover, as you can tell from this conversation, pretty much everything that's interesting, all the big questions.